Hi everyone, it's Laura and I hope you're all doing really well. Today I'm going to be talking through the books that I read in the month of November. It was an interesting reading month. I read a couple of things I really enjoyed and then a couple of okay things, and basically didn't get as much reading done as I'd like to, but in what world do I ever read as much as I'd like to be honest? So the first one I'm going to start with is Virgin Envy, which is written by various different people. It's a collection of essays, and this was the pick for our November-December Feminist Orchestra Book Club, the details of which I'll leave in the description box below if you would like to join us on Goodreads. And this was really interesting. It's not quite what I expected, but I still got quite a lot out of it. And when Jean and I were talking about this book the other weekend together, like, the more I spoke about it with people, the more I realised I'd actually got a lot out of it. This is a collection of, I think it's 8 essays. It's not that many. And really what they say in the introduction is that there's not very much research or discussion that's been had about the representation of virginity in media. So there really isn't that much academic essays that you can include in a book like this. I think I was expecting this to be a little bit more general and to flow a little bit better, which happens in books of essays that I tend to read, more non-fiction leaning books, whereas this is a much more academic book and each essay is incredibly specific. It feels like it's someone's dissertation. For example, some of the earlier ones are on the representations of virginity within Mills and Boon romantic novels, but specifically looking at how that overlaps with the idea of the sheikh and like an Eastern romance and the idea of virginity in that culture as opposed to the West, which is actually a very interesting concept, but it's really looking at 3 specific books and comparing them, for example. And it does feel a bit like that throughout this collection. Some of the essays are brilliant, especially when they're talking about something like Twilight and the representations of virginity of Bella and Edward in those books. I understand that because I've seen those films, so I understand what it's referring to. She also talks about there's a vampire in the True Blood series who is always a virgin, so there's an essay looking on that. So some of those aspects I thought were incredibly interesting. However, there are some essays here on the concept of queer virginity and specifically sort of male homosexual virginity and how that's handled within these specific books and how those characters in those books deal with their virginity and losing their virginity and what that means for someone when you're gay as opposed to straight. And like in theory that would have been a really interesting essay, but it actually in practice ended up being like a critique of these specific books that I hadn't read. So that was a bit of a shame, and there is something in the introduction of these collection where they lament in a way the lack of research into the idea of queer virginity as opposed to straight virginity. Like our idea of virginity is normally a woman being penetrated by a man, and there's obviously lots of different ways that people can be sexually active, and they say in here like more people should do research on this. There aren't enough essays on this, and they flag up that they haven't really covered it in this collection, so that's quite interesting. Yeah, so overall quite mixed, I think. Like it felt quite academic. It didn't feel like it flowed really easily, but the essays that I did enjoy I thought were really interesting. So if you find the concept of this interesting at all, especially representation in books and films, then I would recommend it, but I'd maybe cherry pick the essays that I read from it. Next we have a collection of short stories which is quite interesting, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but there's some definitely very good points in it, and that's Southern Traveller by Sarah Hall. There's 7 stories in this collection. Some of them are quite long, some of them are quite short, and each of them is just incredibly different and really imaginative. And I think one of my big takeaways from reading this collection is just how well structured each of her stories are, and just in a few pages really you get such a full picture of these characters' lives and their wider lives, their histories. It all connects together so well, and I think she's done that brilliantly. I feel like what links these stories in a way is that each one seems to almost take a different idea of a different chapter in a woman's life. There's a lot of looking at things like mothers and daughters relationships, sexual relationships, like teenage awakenings and when you're older. I don't know, there's something along that line that I feel like was a thread through these stories, but apart from that they are so disparate. There's one story where an older man sees a woman on holiday who he believes might be the daughter of like an ex-girlfriend, so his ex-stepdaughter who he knew 15 years ago, and just seeing her walk past in the place where he's living, he's sort of reliving that entire relationship and his relationship with the little girl, which is really really touching and quite interesting about how people can just be so important in your lives, but just for a few years, and then you might never see them again. There's another story about a young woman who has a very difficult relationship with her mother and is turning 30, and she seems to struggle to sort of fit in with kind of, I guess, suburban city middle class life, and she's dealing with that. There's a story about a woman who turns into a harpy at night and goes flying around the cities destroying men who prey on women. It's like every single story is so different and like it's come out of the head of a different person, and I think that's really interesting. If you like that in short story collections, she's done something really interesting there, and each of them has quite a mournful sense about them, something of loss and of pain. So in a way, it's very interesting to read. It's not like fun to read. I don't know whether that is a criteria that you want when you're reading a book. So at the end of it, I was a bit like, oh, that was quite hard going. And that doesn't mean that there's some really difficult topics in here necessarily. It's just the way she writes. As I say, each of these stories are so different. It's like they could be in completely different genres. And yet her voice was so distinctive. So yeah, very interesting one. And I think I'm still mulling over in my head what I think of it really. Next, a book I really thoroughly enjoyed and would very much recommend. I absolutely loved it, and that's Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. This has been, before I read this book, I just heard it compared to Bridget Jones. People saying, oh, Queenie's a black Bridget Jones. And now that I've read it, I feel really annoyed with that comparison, because I understand what people are doing. They're trying to say it's that sort of single woman in London living her life. But I think it really takes away from what Queenie is, because she's not like Bridget Jones at all. She's completely her own person. And what this book reminded me of more is Bridesmaids. It reminded me very much, like the whole tone of the book and how it continues down the plot, it really reminded me of the part where Kristen Wiig is just going crazy and everything is going wrong in her life and it gets worse and worse and worse, but it's still quite funny and ridiculous in how desperate she's becoming. That's what this reminded me of. Queenie is in her 20s, she's working for a magazine in London, and she's just come out of a breakup, essentially a 2-year relationship which she really loved the guy, and he's ended it with her, and she's sort of struggling to understand why. And while she's coming to terms with that, everything else in her life is kind of going wrong. She's sleeping with very questionable people. She's not getting on at work properly. She's dealing with some very bad history with her mum. But what I really enjoyed about this book is that wasn't centre stage. It wasn't like, oh, she was damaged as a child, so therefore XYZ. She felt like a very real, full person who did have, some difficulties in her past, but that's not defining her now. She's still her own character. And you're really seeing her relationship with different friends that she's got from different parts of her life, her relationship with her Jamaican grandparents, and that just brings such a source of humour to the book. There's little transcripts of her group chat with her friends, which literally I was full on laughing out loud. When things were going wrong with her with other men, I was getting so angry and I was so in it. I feel like her character is just so fully formed and fleshed out. You really believe her and you just get really behind her. I think it's plotted very well. It's very interesting in what it talks about, because Queenie has kind of issues with dating black men, so she tends to date white men, and so issues arise with culturally how like white men see her as kind of like a sexual object, how it was difficult with her boyfriends, her ex-boyfriend's family, and it's conversations and questions like that which help you just really relate to Queenie, because nothing feels like it's been shoehorned into the book. Everything just feels like this is part of her life. These are different aspects of her life that she has to deal with. She's not always thinking about every topic to do with her race or to do with her mother or to do with her ex-boyfriend. She's not always thinking of everything in every moment of the day, but it's all there in the background and it makes up who she is and it makes up her experiences. And all of that just feel like it was so seamless, the way it was worked into the plot, and I just thought it was fantastic. Really loved it. Then a book which I did really like, I'm not sure I loved it 5 stars, but maybe like 3 to 4 stars. It was really good, and that's The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. And I was sent this really beautiful copy by Vintage. Is it Vintage? Yes, good. I was suddenly like, have I got the right publisher? Because she's written a new book, which is The Starless Sea, which sounds really interesting. And I thought I'd read this first to get an idea of her writing style. And this is a really magical book. It's about two magicians, and we start in a kind of Victorian period where each of them, they're having a war with each other, or a wager, I suppose. And so each of them takes a child, a boy and a girl, and they train them to be the best magicians ever. And so that they're going to pit them against each other, their talents essentially. And the arena for this wager is this Night Circus. It's a secret travelling circus which goes all over the place, only opens at night, and you have magical acrobats, illusionists, tarot card readers, contortionists, all this magical stuff happening in the circus. But at the heart of it are these people who can actually do real magic, which is sort of a secret, and they're creating these magical tents and exhibitions within the circus as part of this competition that they have between them. And all of the stuff about the circus I loved. I thought it was so, such a wonderful world, and she really painted all these imaginative different exhibitions and acts and tricks that people are putting on. There are a couple of different timelines happening together, and you're kind of converging on the culmination of this competition and what's going to happen at the end. Unfortunately, that is where I think this book slightly went off the rails a little bit. What we have is these young woman and man essentially growing up in this circus, being competitors, and obviously kind of falling in love because they respect each other so much. And then, oh no, there's tension because they're in competition with each other, but they're also in love. And that was great, and I was kind of going on with it, but I'm not sure I believed their relationship towards the end of it, and the end just got a little bit messy. There are lots of different timelines happening from different people's perspectives, converging at different rates to this finale when you find out what happened to them. But it felt like when it did all come together, I felt quite disappointed, and it felt a little bit messy, and it felt like there was a big build-up throughout the whole book, and then it just kind of went whoa at the end, and I wasn't really sure what had happened. I don't think it was clear. I feel like when she was writing this, it seems like she was imagining different scenes of a film, like, oh, you'll see this from this person's perspective, then you'll see this. But as it was written, I was like, I'm not getting what I'm supposed to be seeing, which is a shame because I really, really enjoyed the reading experience of it. And it's annoying, isn't it? Because I don't want to say I didn't enjoy this book, because I did, and I actually would really recommend reading it. I just think critically, at the end of it, I was like, oh, that's annoying. I can't say this is one of my favourite books ever. Still really glad that I read it, and I'm very much looking forward to reading The Starless Sea, because that's a similar kind of magical world, I think, but about books and reading, and I'm like, sounds perfect for me. So that's my lot for November. I would love to hear what you've been reading. It's just that time of year, isn't it? I feel like every weekend starts getting very busy. It's leading up to Christmas, lots and lots going on. And I always have a little bit of a slump at the end of the year and end up not reading as much, which is annoying because there's lots of good things I want to read. But I would love to hear from you what you've been reading, what you're planning to read before the year is out. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye.